Okay, I found it. Thank you very much. I'm very glad that my tie is still there, and I'm very glad that the microphone is also working, so I can start the talk. First of all, let me say many thanks. Many thanks to the Wong family for having invited me to this very prestigious, to give this very prestigious talk. And many thanks to the the National University of Singapore for hosting me so generously. I'm very happy with the hospitality, and it's been indeed a pleasure to actually share ideas with my colleagues in CDTL, with Wan Hoon, and I hope many other colleagues in the week to come as I leave next Thursday, a week from now. Now, having done the red carpet, I think I can actually start talking about my topic. First of all, I think you should, already Johan has stolen the show. He's told you quite a lot about myself. So I will be very brief there. What I'm going to say is simply that I consider myself very much a teacher, first and foremost, with a lot of interest in higher education studies, and particularly in how individuals actually lead the changes in higher education at times of complexity and at times which are very difficult indeed. Now, I know that the situation in Singapore is different. I know that you are well funded still, but the situation is not the same in other parts of the world. So what I am aiming to do here is to give you a reflective account, if you want, which emerges from the literature, from the scholarly literature in higher education studies, about the status and state of higher education today. You can use that as a mirror to see yourself in, to see how fortunate perhaps you are, but also perhaps to stimulate some thoughts and some reflections further on when you think about your own institution. Obviously, if you wish to know more, I've provided you with a bibliography so that you don't need to rush and write down references and all that. So I hope that's clear. Now, in terms of relevance, I know that in the public, in the audience, there is a lot of people from this university, but also people from outside. So let me highlight very briefly what the relevance of the talk is. For a start, I think the relevance is for HE academics, but not just academics, professionals. Because one of the takes I take on higher education is that higher education is a community made not just by academics. There is a lot of people who contribute to higher education, whose work is absolutely important for its workings. So this talk is for them to stand back and reflect on the status of higher education in its totality by focusing on its virtuousness, because there are some virtues in what universities are doing today, but there is also some perniciousness as well. And how perhaps to overcome those pernicious effects that we are testifying around the world. And reflect on a possible way, this is my very modest ethical interprofessionalism, is my very modest proposal, to how we can manage the perniciousness. More broadly, for people who are not in this university and who are not in higher education, it's a talk which will allow you to actually think about university as a mirror of the society in which we live, and see where the links are between the wider society and the system of universities today. To start with, my argument is supported by an overall question. And the question is, at times of change and complexity in our education, is it possible for academics and other HE workers, professionals, to reinstate a common sense of purpose? How? Obviously, this question begs a sub-question, that before there was a common sense of purpose, that it's now been lost. And obviously, if you look at the narrative about university rather than higher education, you can see that in the past, and not in the very far past, up to 30, 40 years ago, people used to write about the idea of university, and they used to write monographs about certain universities. In England, especially in the UK, universities are very, very pleased to actually write their own monographs. So you have monographs about the University of Cambridge, of Oxford, University of London, and all that. What has changed over the last 40 years is that common sense of purpose, which was basically based on two activities, research and teaching, has been lost. At least this is what the literature tells us. And this is the story which I want to go through with you in telling you how this has changed, what has changed, and what we can do to remedy that, if possible, at all. The structure of the talk is going to be based on 3 basic concepts. The overall talk is about transformations in higher education. I'm going to talk to you about academic work. The history, the narrative about academic work, is a narrative of complexity. In other words, academic work is not what it used to be in the past. It's something much more complex. And it might be useful to actually see what these complexities are. The second one is academic practice and practices. That is to say, what academics do today according to what was traditionally done before or not done before. And the third one is academic identities. In other words, how do people identify themselves with the institutions in which they work and with the sector in which they work, or not, for that matter. In other words, what happens at the micro level within these big institutions? This is really what I'm interested in. And the fifth and the fourth concept is the concept of ethical interprofessionalism, which marries 2 things. It marries ethics with interprofessionalism, which is about bringing together different constituencies within a university in an ethical way to actually help university progress. Right. Before we delve deeper into the issue of transformations in higher education, may I tell you a little story about myself and about my past as a student. I'm Italian. I lived for 25 years in Italy. I did my first degree in Italy before I then emigrated to Britain, from which I've been Brexited after 30 years of my life there. So I'm a non-entity at the moment. I'm neither Italian nor British. I don't know what I am, and I'm waiting with bated breath to understand where I am situated in Europe. Anyway, when I was a child, I used to study classics. I went to what we call in Italian liceo classico, which is the high school where you study classics, namely Latin and ancient Greek. There was a year in which my Latin went really down, and simply was because there was a big antipathy between myself and my teacher of Latin. We just didn't get on well. I didn't understand what he was on about. He didn't understand what I was on about, and I failed. So during the summer, we had this system in Italy where you could recoup what you hadn't done during the year. So I was very hot months in Italy. So my father said, I will still take you to the seaside, because that's what we do in the summer. I will still take you on the seaside, but on one premise, that you actually read the whole of the book by Ovid, which was the culprit of my failure in Latin. So I said, okay, I will read it. But my father said, do not obsess with the translation, because that was my failing point. My father said, just read the whole book, because the whole book gives very important messages, and at the end of the summer, I want you to tell me what these messages are. So I sat on this veranda, looking at the seaside, feeling sad for myself. And eventually, I really got into the book. I don't know whether any of you has read this book, but it's a wonderful book. It's an epic in 15 books, each book based on a different myth, which tells you a big story about change. In other words, how gods can change us, how we can change nature. In other words, if you stand back from the niceties of the book is a big, big educator about change, what change means. What are the features of change? And this book has come back to be useful for me these days when I try to understand metamorphoses and change in higher education. Higher education is undergoing a period of intensity in terms of its transformation. In other words, governments across the world are asking higher education to do more and more things and to do them more and more and better by the minute. Higher education is a correlation of elements, and therefore this concept of quality and excellence concerns not only academics, but high management. It concerns the whole community. And therefore, change, as Ovid actually say, it's in the relation of things. It's not in the isolation of things. So when you want to understand change, you've got to understand how the whole plays, not just how individual pieces play. The rapidity of change, and this is very, very true, especially in the UK. Until 1980, the UK higher education system was very much stable in a sense. It was a system which was based on principles of liberalism. It was embracing ideas of equality, of opportunity, and all that, until Margaret Thatcher arrived. And then everything changed. Within 5 years, everything changed. And the major change was in the intrusion, in inverted commas, of the state into the affairs of the university. In other words, universities were not anymore those ivory towers which we used to talk about once, but they became centers of excellence, centers of high quality, centers that had to respond to the needs of society. Society, in other words, wanted to know the value for money that universities were. And therefore, as soon as you start introducing this into the equation of what a university is, university, of course, comes closer to society, which is good for polity, because it makes university not isolated from the world, but it makes it part of the world. But at the same time, it creates a lot of problems, because universities, in a sense, have always self-regulated themselves. And the fact that they were going to be regulated by other bodies was very, very problematical. This has provoked a lot of resistance, especially in academics. A lot of academics, and I can testify that because I've researched the area, a lot of academics don't like this state of things. They actually regret having lost a lot of the power that they used to have in university, and they still cling on this idea, which at times is very contestable, of academic freedom. It's something which I would like to discuss somewhere at some other time. What is academic freedom? Is it the freedom to do whatever you want? Or is it the freedom to just distance yourself from society because your research has to be distanced from society? You've got to do something for knowledge, not something for the industry, for example. And then there is a lot of, what you find around when you ask academics, that there is a lot of resilience and persistence. In other words, people, in spite of all the problems, still like to be in universities. Universities are still seen by people as hubs of creation of knowledge and communication of knowledge, and people like that. So people persist, and they put up a lot of resilience, but at the same time, there is a lot of unhappiness about the state of affairs. What is not really happening, although people are still struggling, is to find new creative ways to actually think about the project of the university. And I'm stressing the project of the university, not the project of higher education, and you will see why in a little moment. So my plea for you is that at the end of this talk, perhaps you may want to think about how you want to see university and higher education change. What are your voices in this? What are your visions for the university? Are you happy with, some people are, with the state of affairs? Or would you like to see something different? The question of creativity and possibility is very, very important, because it's only these two forces which bring university forward. If we don't think about university as an entity and what it does for us and what it does for our kids and what it does for our future, I think we are failing part of our duty as academics. And you can throw tomatoes at me later on if you want. Right, let's go into the matter, into the core of the matter. When we talk about HEA metamorphosis, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side rather, you can see the state of affairs as it used to be, and now progressively it has changed over time. As I was alluding before we used to talk about university, there was a lot being written. I mean, you may have heard about Newman, Cardinal Newman, in the 19th century. You may have heard about von Humboldt in the 18th century. They were talking about the two pillars of higher education. Newman was very much about teaching. Universities about transmitting knowledge. Whereas Humboldt was about research, but linking it to teaching as well. In other words, he was seeing the link between teaching and research as fundamental in the university project. Now, when you start reading the higher education literature, which has become an industry in itself, it's grown massively over the last 30 years, you start seeing that the discourse is not about university anymore, the idea of university. It's more about the idea of higher education. And higher education is not one university, it's the sector which embraces all the different universities. Obviously, when you have a sector instead of individual universities, the state finds it easier to control. And therefore, instead of dealing with each university, they deal with a sector as such. And this is why today we talk about the higher education sector rather than universities. While universities themselves are becoming more and more corporate universities. In other words, people feel affiliation with their universities in a corporativist way. I mean, we care about logos, we care about the way in which we present our universities, booklets and all the rest of it. That speaks of corporativism. And there is this increasing importance of the state. The state, I'll give you again an example in Britain, but it's true across Europe. The state is saying to people, what are you doing to deserve my money? What are you doing to deserve money for the excellence in your teaching? What are you doing to deserve the money for the excellence in your research? As you demonstrate this to me, money will be released. So there is this tacit pact, which is not actually tacit, it's very explicit, between the state and the university. In the past, as I was saying before, there was a weak link with society. Universities were part of society. In the Western tradition, universities served the church initially, and then they served the state. If you think about the idea of the German university, for example, that was built for the industry, to bring forward industrial innovation. Okay? Higher education today makes this link much, much more solid and much, much more direct. And therefore, we have phenomena like accountability, quality regimes, and managerialism. These are three things which are fairly recent, which have had a lot of very beneficial effects, as we will see later on university life, but there is some perniciousness there as well. The third change has been the change in student population. We used to have universities which were just places where elites would go to. In the past, in England, if you think about 30 years ago, it was about 5% of the population, of the adult population, would have gone to university. Now it's over 40%. And it's not only the quantity which has changed, but the quality. There are people coming from all walks of life, from all races, gender, and all the rest of it. This has complexified what a university is. And of course, it makes not only managing the university, but simply teaching and researching a more challenging, but also a more complex affair. And so there's been the rise of the student voice, but also the rise of the student services, which you see all over campus here as well. So in the past, university was state-funded. Today, we have marketization. Now, this does not concern, from what I understand, Singapore so much. But it's going on quite a lot in America, it's going on quite a lot in the UK, and it's going on quite a lot in Australia. In other words, higher education is becoming a commodity for which students pay quite hefty fees. To the point that in England, for example, now you pay up to £9,000 per year if you are an undergraduate, which is a lot of money, if you think about it. This has brought with itself the idea of competitiveness, when universities before were about collaboration, now we have competitiveness, internationalization, and a business ethos, which, when it percolates to the level of a simple lecturer like me, it means that not only do I have to think about the structure of my curriculum, I have to sell my degree. Okay? I have to position myself within the market. And that's something which takes time, energy, and it's at times dispiriting, because I was not brought up to be a market expert. I'm an academic. So why should I become a market expert all of a sudden? And then knowledge. The nature of knowledge has changed as well. We've gone from theoretical knowledge, which was at the basis of the university, to usable knowledge. In other words, knowledge which brings you directly to employment, so the employability agenda. And finally, the increase in technology, which has been changing everything from the way in which we do administration to the way in which we do teaching. It allows us to reach more students, for example, out, in line with the internationalization agenda, but at the same time it's changing as well the way in which we look at teaching and learning. Now, what does this all mean for academic work, practices, and identities? In other words, what I want to do now is to actually see how each of these, how all of these things that we've seen about the changes in higher education impact on these three categories. Now, the literature on these three categories will tell you stories which are very similar, but are very different as well. So there's going to be an element of repetition. But the element of repetition is important in itself, because it really signals what is really happening in universities. So bear with me. In this slide, what I'm trying to do, whenever I try to explain a concept, what I want to do is, first of all, to give you a sense of the concept and then how it applies to higher education. Now, if you read any books on the sociology of work, you can see that over time, over the centuries, work has come to be understood in very different ways. In the past, it was understood as the sum, the bulk, of what one does in their occupation. In other words, there was very much a quantitative feel to what we consider to be work. Work was reified, it was something out there which could be quantified. But work, also in English if you think, there is name which is work, but there is also a verb which is to work, which means that work is not just a product, it's a process. And therefore we should be mindful of what that process is. What managers do to that process. It's not very useful to think just about the products and the outcomes without thinking about the processes which link us to our work. But also work is not pure. Into work, as individuals, we bring into it our expectations, our vision, our beliefs, our values, and therefore everything is tainted with an ontological halo, if you like. Work is something which belongs to us. We care terribly about work. And therefore, when our view of work is actually undermined, we react in a certain way. So if we look at academic work trends, these are very much context dependent, but the literature says quite a lot about it. First of all, the meanings and scope of work have become multiple and opaque. In other words, a lot of people who are interviewed about what is academic work, they actually ask the question themselves, what is it? Today I cannot decide anymore whether I am a researcher, a teacher, an administrator. Am I the three of them? Am I specializing? Am I being a generalist? There is a sense of confusion because, in a sense, the university is saying to you, you need to specialize in your research if you want to go up your career ladder. But at the same time, there are other discourses, for example, about becoming excellent in learning and teaching, doing your service and everything else. This is confusing for quite a lot of people who don't actually grasp anymore what the university project is all about. There is the nature of hyper-specialization and genericity. In other words, we are being asked to be specialists within our own disciplines, but there is a growing demand for interdisciplinarity. And there is a strong sense that we've got to align teaching and research, which again is something new, which costs work, and which costs a lot of thinking, which needs to be addressed by management and by the government. In terms of feeling, there is a feeling of flexibility. We've got to be flexible workers. And this does not apply just to us. It applies to a lot of people in other services. We have to be flexible. And the word flexible today is being changed into being agile. This is the new one, which I've been reading all the time. Being flexible is being transformed into being agile, which is really, which makes us all sportsmen and sportswomen in a sense. And you can see from my points that I'm not one of them. I'm not that agile at all. So what we've got to do, in other words, what universities are asking us to do, is to continuously adapt to the two demands which are basically determined by governments and they filter through by senior management. And this again causes a lot of consternation in the minds of the people who actually work in universities. There are systemic changes. Universities used to be places where there were just disciplines, departments based around disciplines and all that. Now there is a vertical structure of services, including academic department, library services, student services, registries, research centers, which complexify the nature of the university. And it's how do we find, and the question is, how do we find harmony? How do we find integration between these services and the academic world? At times there is a lot of friction between these two things. Quantity and density. Multitasking. This is what people talk about when they're asked about their work. They say that we have to learn to be multitaskers. And they lament the situation because multitasking, although makes you more productive in several areas, at the same time distracts you from your purpose. And therefore, very often, it's not a very good thing, and a lot of academics actually says that. Changing our hats all the time during the day is not ideal if we want to actually reach a goal. We've got to be very careful with multitasking. And then there are rupture points. People feel insecure in their jobs. They feel that if they don't reach certain standards, their jobs are at risk. There is also a big casualization of jobs. In other words, universities rely more and more and more not on staff which is permanently there, but on a lot of casual staff, which again adds another element of complexity to the university and to the sense of ownership people have of it. So I'm not going to read this, but Tara Fitzgerald, who is an eminent writer in higher education, talks about the change from the Donish domination, which was in the past the case of the university, in other words, it was the academics who actually determined the affair of the university, to something else which is made up of a lot of internal and external forces within the university, like quality regimes, quality offices, accountability, and all the rest of it, making the nature of the university completely different. And this brings us to the second concept, which is the concept of practice and practices, as I say there. The story about academic practice is a story about opacity. What I've noticed in my job is that when you ask people things such as, what is academic practice? What is excellent? What is quality? People don't know. There is not a consensus about it. On the one hand, this is a good thing, but on the other hand, we live by a lot of empty signifiers. In other words, we actually use words without really understanding what they are. Okay? And these are used as means to actually keep you down, if you like. Because the less you understand what they mean, the better it is. Okay? So, but if you look at the literature about practice, the literature about practice is very, very rich. And if you have to read anything, read the literature about practice. It's useful for everybody in the world. Practice is defined by a compatriot of mine who works at the University of Warwick, Nicolini, as contextual patterns of performance. In other words, practice cannot be reified. And this is the first thing that universities should know. When you talk about practice, practice is what happens in your institution. It's not what happens elsewhere. You can use the elsewhere to inspire your practice, but practice is dependent on context. The second thing is that practice implies thinking, doing, saying, and sense-making. In other words, it's not just what people do, but it's also what they declare they do, and more than that, how they make sense of what they do. So that's another area which deserves a lot of attention. Practices can be very resistant over time There is an element of historicity about practices because there's sediments which have been there over time of practice, and at times they're taken for granted, and this is what makes it difficult to actually change them. But without understanding what is the historical dimension of practice, it's very difficult then to actually change them. Because what are you changing? Are you making a normative judgment about what practice should be? Or are you being sensitive to what happens within a certain context? Relationality. Practice never happens in a silo. In other words, when we talk about teaching practice should be related to research practice. In other words, nothing happens in isolation and by itself. We need to talk and think about university in relational way when we talk about practice. And then we have the ontological project again. I mean, practice is about being part of our profession, but becoming something else as you evolve in that profession. Again, there is a very personal investment in that. Now, compare this with a piece of research that myself, Johan, and another number of researchers around the world have been doing on academic practice. I took, because I felt I had nothing better to do one day, I decided, well, big lie, I decided that I had to start visiting a lot of websites in UK universities to see how they define academic practice. And I was terribly disappointed because the definitions were very, very flat. Okay? So, for example, they were talking in very essentialist and normative ways. This is the way in which you do research. This is the way in which you do teaching. This is the way in which you write your essay. Okay? So practice was mostly addressed to the students, was addressing the students, and was saying, you've got to be, if you want to belong to academia, you've got to write in this way. In a sense, there was a deficit model behind that. Very often it was conflated with the notion of academic integrity and academic conduct, which is also very dangerous, because academic practice is not just about academic integrity and academic conduct. It is part of it. There is a relation, but it's not the whole story. And the most astonishing thing is that academic practice appeared in a lot of websites as separated from learning and teaching and research. It never appeared in these areas. It appears in generic areas as a reified concept. So what is academic practice? I couldn't understand what it was, except that you need to do, in order to do academic practice, you need to write in this way, you need to speak in this way, and all that. Very behavioristic. Now, when you go to the literature becomes much more demanding in the way they respond to academic practice. First of all, academic practice is multiple and nebulous. In other words, people do not know exactly what it is. But one thing is very clear, is that in academic practice there is a lot of disjuncture between, and misalignment between what people do, for example, in research and what people do in teaching. So academic practice is not conceived in an integrated way, but it's conceived in a very siloed way. The way people do research, the way people do teaching. There was, in the literature, there is a need to actually address the question of agency. In other words, who is it exactly that defines what academic practice is? Is it the government? Is it university? Is it the individual academics? Who defines what academic practice is? So the question of agency in definitional terms was also there. There was also a sense for contextualization, as I was saying. And then there is a lot being said about how technology is actually changing academic practice, not only practice in itself, but practitioners as well. In other words, how are you changing from being a classroom teacher to be a digital teacher, for example, and what the implication of that is. So as you can see, this kind of the literature says a much deeper story about academic practice than, for example, what universities declare about academic practice, particularly in the UK. I don't know anywhere else, but I did this search just to see this. We have an essentialist view versus a very complex view, but the result of this is one of opacity, We don't know what it is, and academic practice is one of these very opaque phrases that are used today in our education, but we don't know exactly what it is because there's no discussion about it. We just say it, we just say the word, we don't know what it is. The third concept, and breath, we are reaching the second part of the talk, academic identities. Academic identities, as much as professional identities, have burgeoned completely since the mid-90s. There was no discourse about academic identities. In other words, nobody would discuss what an academic was. There was an understanding that an academic was somebody who would teach and research. Nobody would take that into account. It was so much obvious. But since mid-90s, you start seeing, if you go into the literature, that there is a lot of talk about academic identities. In other words, once the idea of the academic has been tainted, has been played with, has been touched on, then people start discussing and start asking themselves, who am I in these institutions? What am I doing here? What is the purpose of what I'm doing? The concept of identity, and I will not be long on this, but in sociology, especially people like Archer, Giddens, Clegg, talk about identities as the midpoint, the cusp, if you like, between the self, which is what we bring inside ourselves, in other words, our beliefs, our expectations, our values, our worldviews, and the structures which surround us. In other words, the professional roles, the expectation, the contractual duties, the institutional regulations, and all that. In the midst of all this, there is our identities, which is, in a sense, it's something semi-solid. It's something which is the solidity, between the solidity of structures and the fluffiness, if you like, of ourselves. This is what they are. If you look at what has happened to academic identities over time, this is what the literature says. There is, first of all, an increased level of reflectivity and reflexivity in terms of academic development. In other words, people are asking more and more themselves what academics are and what they do. If there is one book that you need to read, it's not my own, it's the book by Mary Henkel, which already in 2000s was actually saying quite a lot of very important things about this topic. There is a lot of anxiety and disappointment. There is a lot of young academics, for example, who've gone into academia thinking that they would do something. They found themselves doing something else, especially administration. And I think you might be familiar with this. Okay? So there is a lot of disappointment because they ask themselves, why am I doing this? I was not here. I did my PhD in anthropology because I was interested in certain societies. Why am I doing so much administration? Or in my case, marketing, indeed. Okay? There is a lot of loss of freedom. People feel that there is a loss of freedom and control on their time. In one article which I wrote with Guzman-Valenzuela, we interviewed a lot of academics in South America and in Spain. And what they think is that there is a contrast between managed time, which university imposes on you, and thinking time. So thinking time is what academics want to be in the game for, but there is a lot of managed time which is imposed onto them. And again, there is a big friction there. There is a loss of control on disciplinary knowledge, which is age-dependent, and I'm not going to be ageist. The younger people, the younger generation welcome interdisciplinarity. They like us actually being challenged in terms of interdisciplinarity. The older folks like me are more resistant. They want to be within their patch, within their disciplines. And so there is a variation there. There is value schisms and value congruence and incongruence. In other words, people talk about how do I align myself with what my university wants me to do? Am I aligned in terms of beliefs and values, or am I completely at odds with it? And then the blurring of professional boundaries. And Celia Whitchurch, also from the Institute of Education in London, has written about the third space. In other words, the coming into being of a number of professionals in higher education, especially the administrators, which actually have a lot of saying and do a lot of things for higher education without being recognized fully for it. Now, what I've said is that what I've portrayed is a very negative picture, and I don't want to be seen as somebody who just brings bad news. As everything in life, there are good things and bad things about everything. You have to look for it. Okay? So there is some virtuousness. I think that generating discourses about quality and excellence is a very good thing, because you've got to raise the bar. Okay? When you start talking about quality and excellence, immediately you have to raise the bar, and you've got to work towards that bar, which is good. Because very often in a lot of universities, there was in the past a lot of complacency about academic work. So talking about quality and excellence is a good thing, because it pushes people up. The second thing is highlighting the whole gamut of academic and professional roles. In other words, these quality regimes and these auditing systems have been shining a light on all the groups of professionals around the university, not just the academics. What are these people doing? What is their contribution to the university? So that's another virtuous thing. The third thing is addressing the balance between research and teaching. Teaching has been always the invisible element within academia, and is now becoming much more visible, precisely because governments are insisting on quality, on quality and excellence in teaching. Money is being put into teaching to put it on a kind of par with research. And we've gone so far in the UK as to have the TEF. Have you heard what the TEF is? It's the Teaching Excellence Framework, which mirrors the Research Excellence Framework. In other words, people want to actually promote people who are good at teaching in the same way as they promote people who are good at research. So that's a very virtuous thing, because it means recognizing an important aspect of our university which has gone always hidden. Opening spaces for interdisciplinarity is a good thing in terms of curriculum design. It's exciting to have, for example, a curriculum design based about the topic of water. How water is seen by an engineer, by a chemist, by a sociologist, by an artist, bringing together these different visions of what different disciplines think about the topic. It's very enriching for knowledge, because it nurtures not only knowledge, but knowledgeability. That is to say, the liminal spaces, the interspaces between different disciplines. Of course, if I am a linguist, I cannot become an engineer overnight, but it's important for me to understand how an engineer reasons without being an engineer. It's important for me to know how a mathematician reasons, and so on. And finally, giving voice to students. Again, before the rhetoric was not even a rhetoric, students did not feature in our education. It was all about the academy. Now students feature, and perhaps they feature too highly as well. I'm just saying perhaps, okay? So giving voice to students is an excellent thing, because after all, students are what make, they make the academy, along with people who teach them. But there is a pernicious aspect about this. And the pernicious aspect is that very often we talk about concepts in our education, as I was saying before, as empty signifiers. What is what is quality? What is quality? Is it quality assurance or quality enhancement? What is the interface between them? What do we mean by quality? Is it a standard, or is it a contextual standard? Is it a norm which applies to everybody around the world, or is it something which applies within an institution, or within a department better, within a discipline? There is role confusion. We've said something about this. We've said that there is now a much more interesting link between teaching and research, but there is limited time. People lament this. There is limited time to actually think creatively about the links between teaching and research. Okay, so there is a lot of new things which are coming up, which are very virtuous, but apparently we don't have the space and the time to actually discuss the meanings of this and the opportunities of this. And I'm talking especially about curriculum design. There is limited space, again, for reflecting about the relationship between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and the identity issues related to this. It's not good enough to say, I want some engineers to work with some artists. There's going to be fire within the room and blood within the room because they will not understand each other. Okay? And they will see the world in very different ways. So what do you do to facilitate these dialogues? Again, this implies a lot of time and space which is needed in our universities. And finally, giving voice to students may give rise, if pushed too much, to a market mentality. In other words, students become customers. And you don't want higher education to become a synonym for a washing machine, I can assure you. And we've reached that stage in Britain today, these days. Higher education is part of the Consumer Act, which means that you can complain about higher education in the same way as you complain for a fridge which doesn't work. Okay? That's a very pernicious road to go down to. So the story that the literature tells us is a story of fragmentation and versus integration. So what do we need to do, really, to re-establish a sense of purpose within the university? Now people are banging their heads against the wall, trying to find a way out of this. And again, looking at the literature in our education, people think that ethics is a way of doing this. In other words, universities have to decide on what are the ethical underpinnings, if you like, of what they're doing within a specific nation and within the world. And people talk about a loss of dialogue, there is a need for reflexivity, there is a need for understanding. People really need to understand what these changes are. And they have really a lot of hunger, if you like, to actually try to understand what these things mean and debating them. There is a need for criticality, for openness, for meaningfulness. All these things seem to have been lost, and some eminent professors of our education are saying we've got to reinstate this within university discourse. Therefore, they talk about ethical professionalism. Ethical professionalism is a construct, if you like, which is made up of three things. It's made up of techne. Techne, all this, by the way, goes back to Aristotle. Okay, so it's nothing new, but it's been revamped very recently. First of all, there is techne. Techne is the way in which we do things. Okay, it's how we process something. But then there is something else, which is not practice, but it's praxis. Praxis, as compared to practice, is a richer concept because it implies a moral underpinning of what we do. In other words, what are we doing what we do for what reason? Okay? So it's not just about doing something, but asking yourself why you're doing it. And is that good? Okay? And then there is eudaimonia, which is a more personal concept, which is happiness. But happiness not in terms of I'm happy, I've gone to the disco and I'm happy. It's much more profound than that. It's happiness to do something useful for the greater good. In other words, how do you find your own space of happiness within a happier society? How do you reconcile and align your sense of happiness with the sense of happiness around you? So the concept of professionalism is very, very complex these days. It's very, very complex because it implies how we do things, understanding what they are, and doing them in an ethical way, which responds to those features. Which responds to those features that we had looked at before. These are the major ones. This means one thing fundamentally, which, according to this literature, has to change in our education. We've got to stop to think about the what and the how, and we've got to introduce within the equation the why. In other words, every time we do something, we've got to actually ask ourselves, what is this? Why are we doing it? What is the purpose for this university, for our students, for our academics, for our society? In other words, the ethical dimension which was missing has to be reinserted, if you like, into the university discourse. So, for example, there is a number of questions that can be asked within an academic community every time you're faced, for example, with a new policy, an idea, or a project. You've got to ask the meaning of the object. What is this policy? What is it? What does it mean? Okay? You've got to understand what is its purpose. Why is it here with us? Okay? This is political questioning, by the way. It's a political act, because you're questioning the powers to be. Okay? Then the third thing is about, is this important? For whom? Why? In other words, what is relevant? Is this good for whom and why? How do I maximize the benefits for the greater majority? In other words, how can I harmonize things so that people are not disgruntled about this? And finally, is it doable? And how? Now, I've been to many university committees, not only in my last university, but in my previous universities, and the emphasis is on this. So you have something and you discuss the how. You know, how do we implement this new policy? But the value of the policy, the values behind the policy, the relevance, they're never really discussed. They're taken for granted. And at times it has to be like that because the government says so. Okay? And if you don't do it that way, you lose funds. So, you know, you can't really do much about it. But I think that there is a fundamental problem about universities regaining their voice within society and saying to the government, hey, wait a moment, okay, you're telling me to do this, why are we doing this? Is this good? Is this really good, as you're saying? And so we go from the notion of ethical professionalism into interprofessionalism. I do believe personally that universities are like ecological systems. You have to be ethical within your own professional domain, be it a doctor, an academic, a surgeon, a dentist, and all that. But you work with a lot of other people in your job. You work at the in the liminal space between yourself and a lot of other people. And therefore, this impetus towards ethicality, if you want, has to be transmitted from one profession to the way in which you work with other professions. What I'm trying to say here is that one thing which I've learned is that for things to work, you've got to understand the wider context and the wider groups which take part in that context around a certain project. So, for example, when we talk about curriculum design, it's not just about academics, it's about registry, it's about librarians. You have to bring all these people together into discussion about what needs to be done. And because you have to understand what their mindset is, and they have to understand what your own mindset is. I've quarreled many times with registries because they don't understand what I'm talking about when I talk about certain curriculum reform, and vice versa, they don't understand me. They say, oh, too fluffy. I say, no, I'm an academic. So I'm asking questions which you're not asking yourself. Okay? Now, the feature of interprofessionalism, first of all, interprofessionalism is not just a practice, it's a mindset. It's a way of thinking about your profession in relation to other professions. Okay? It implies an ecological view and vision of things. In other words, you look at the global, not only the local, and you relate the local to the global. It implies working at the boundaries. It implies a concept of liminality, so that by working with people, not only you give your knowledge within your specific field, but you actually learn, and this is called knowledge ability, you actually learn what it means to work with other people, and you learn from them. It implies reflectivity and reflexivity. In other words, it implies not only you thinking about yourself and your practice, but you reflecting on the practice of other people, reflexivity. It implies dialogism, dialogue. It implies you talking to people, communication. And it implies knowledge and knowledgeability. Again, these two concepts I was telling you about, which are very important. We need not only to be knowledgeable in our fields, we've got to actually improve our knowledgeability. In other words, an understanding of what the people do us within the system. So ethical interprofessionalism, and this is a personal take, nobody has done this, I've done it, so blame me for this. It's a way of knowing, acting, and being that is participatory, expansive, and integrative. It is critically reflective in that it filters our action through values. In other words, it brings values into the fold. We don't only just think about what is this thing, we think, why are we doing this thing? Its foundations lie in collective meaning-making and transforming practice into praxis. In other words, practice which is informed by values. It is based on openness to understand and learn from different constituencies in an institution. And as a mindset, it can be applied to wider questions pertaining to the university, what is quality, what is excellence, but also to more daily projects. In other words, how do we work together around a project, for example, about interdisciplinarity? What do we need to do to achieve that successfully? If we transfer this into higher education, ethical interprofessionalism, to me, first of all, is a way of governance. In other words, how the university wants and is willing to enlarge spaces for discussions about things which happen within their community. Okay, research, teaching, policy making, and all that. In true dialogue with all these constituencies for the resolution of the problems. And I know it's very difficult, but the road to democracy is always difficult. Ethical interprofessionalism can also be understood as professional practice. In other words, it should not just be what senior management think about the way of governing a university, but it should be professional practice. We should all practice it from top to bottom, from bottom to top. And finally, we should start rethinking, universities should start rethinking about the resources for this, especially in terms of career efforts. I'll tell you what I mean by this. Very often today, when you want to be promoted, you're promoted on the merits of your research. Sometimes today, and increasingly so, you get promoted for your teaching. But my view is that promotion is about profiling. In other words, what an individual does for an institution and for society as a whole. It's not just about how many papers they produce. It's not just about how excellent teachers they are. It's how they do something which is good for your university and for the world at large. Profiling is something which is now being experimented in Holland and certainly in Australia for career purposes. In other words, these famous tracks, the teaching tracks, the research tracks and all that, are being put into question. And people are saying, really, what are these people doing interprofessionally, if you like, to actually bring value to the university system? Now, I'm sure, and this is going to come in our discussion, you're going to accuse me of idealism. You're going to say to me that I'm utopian. But I also want to say to you that I think that utopia very often runs things forward, brings things forward. So I want to preserve a nice little niche for utopia. It's very, very important. As we've seen so far, society has been molding university life over the last 30 years. I think it is time that university actually says to society, we are becoming a model for you as well. We are acting in ethical ways which you should mirror when you do other things in society. In other words, this misalignment between university life and society should be addressed so that university gain back their voice that they have lost over time. Finally, to do this, we need continuous effort, patience, and resilience. And let me come back to Ovid. Ovid says something very, very important in one of his works, which is called Amores, which is loves. He wrote a lot about love as well, apart from change. He said, be patient and tough. Someday this pain will be useful to you. And very often, when I get up in the morning and I feel, I don't want to go to work, I don't want to see this, I don't want to go to this meeting, I get up and I think, no, this pain is actually useful, because this pain will actually push you to do things which may be for the good of the wider cause. So deep reflections on the nature, aims and purpose of the university are really, really wanted, so that we can transform what is change, which is something top-down, into innovation, which is something which is much more collegial and it's bottom up. And this is really for the benefit, not only, I think, very modestly, and this is my modest proposal, it's not only for the benefit of universities, but for society at large, because I really think that universities should regain their voices in modeling what society is like, rather than the other way around. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roberto. We have time for some questions. Please let us know, and we have people with microphones in the aisles. Maybe I can just quickly, if I could be so bold, just quickly ask one question right at the end, and then we'll go over to the audience. But I'm burning to ask you this. Right at the end, you talked about collegiality. So that's something that I'd like to ask you about. How does collegiality fit into your argument, into your message about professional, ethical interprofessionalism? What is the role of collegiality? How can we conceive of collegiality at university?
I think collegiality is very important, and I think collegiality is it's in the very backbone, if you like, of the university project. You know, university have been created to actually for communities of people who work together for the sake of knowledge, for the betterment of knowledge and the communication of knowledge. Now, very often systems have militated against collegiality. For example, the career systems have militated against collegiality because, for example, you are promoted for one thing rather than another. Talking about academic practice, the one thing about academic practice which is interesting, it's not only studying, you know, what it is, but also to discover the the dark side of it. Academia life is not a nice life. People stab each other's backs all the time. And I think this is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. We've got to collaborate. If we are in a university, we've got to have nobler and higher aspirations. And that is to collaborate for the sake of knowledge and the sake of our students, rather than backstabbing each other for power things, for power relationships.
Okay, thanks. Right at the back.
Can I ask you? Yes. Dr. Napoli, I'd like to thank you very much for the talk. I followed with great interest your argument, the premises that you put into place, as well as the conclusion that you came up to. I also, as I was listening to you, I kept going back and forth because I couldn't understand whether you were ultimately in favor of or against the kind of trends that you were talking about. It seemed, because what I was listening for was a way to resolve what I think of as fundamentally conflicting ideologies.
Yes.
And I think that while I appreciate what you've come up with, I mean, we always have to look for some kind of hope, some way of resolving what we see as a paradox. I see yours as a kind of perhaps not so much a utopian view, but as a pragmatic view. And I would like to ask whether actually this may not actually be a solution that is transformative in the way that you might be imagining it. Just, I mean, forgive me, it's possibly my ignorance that's making me say this, but no. I feel as though what's coming out of it is a kind of a kumbaya kind of a thing, which might actually end up intensifying the neoliberal trends that produce the, you know, sense of dejection, anxiety, and so on.
So what would you propose?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, you see. It doesn't mean that I would immediately have something to propose. I do appreciate that you've built this up. I mean, it's something that has to come in small stages. But I can't see the transformative value of this. I feel like what it's doing is it is intensifying this direction of neoliberalism, which is to put all the responsibility back on the individual. I see the kind of thing that you're proposing as increasing maybe the emotional labor that is called upon every time, you know, the neoliberal enters the state. So I really do, I love the way you built up your argument. I'm just not sure where the transformative element is.
I mean, I'm sorry if I didn't sound that radical. Because I am radical in my heart, but I think that at times in public lectures you've got to be appreciative of a lot of things. I mean, it's part, after all, of the academic debate. You've got at times to look at the good and at the bad side of things. Now, I wholeheartedly hate neoliberalism. I hate certain ways of expressing itself. I hate the way in which what it's doing to people, and I would like to get rid of it. The problem is that when you talk about change, change is gradual. And change is never, unless you want to have a revolution, unless you want to have a war and capsize things, change has to be gradual. And it has to talk to the idea of dialogue. And I'm sorry if I didn't come up strongly on that one, but I don't think that it's about just the individual within the university. It's also about the governance. And I think that's very important. You know, it's the government that has to say we have to work in a different way, because the way in which we are working makes a lot of people suffer as a consequence. So it has to come from there, but it also has to become the practice within the academic community, so that, you know, all that backstabbing, that infighting does not exist. I hate being in those power games, which are so intrinsic to academic life. So as academics, very often what we do, we tend to blame senior management, but actually we do a lot of bad to ourselves by the very way in which we behave. So I think it's a meeting at a meso level, if you like, between what people can do at the top and what we can do from the bottom.
Could I just ask questioners to indicate briefly who they are? Sorry, I forgot to ask you. You just want to say? Yeah.
Okay, my name is Shoba. Oh, sorry, it's not. My name is Shoba, and I'm from the Center for English Language Communication.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your answer.
No, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rowan Young from the Department of Chemistry. I'm over here, sorry.
Hi.
I can stand up. Just wondering what advice you'd have for academics, how to start implementing some of your suggestions about how to become more ethical without being penalised, given that we're interacting with society and, you know, what you might suggest are unethical institutions in the way that we being made to teach certain things or conduct research in certain areas that we might question the value of that. How do we avoid penalising ourselves by becoming more ethical?
I said at the beginning that I would not give easy answers to this. It's a framework, and it's up to you to decide what you want. But I think your question is very pertinent. To me, for example, I can give you an example. When people talk about curriculum design in terms of interdisciplinarity, now what happens there is that you have a retrenching of different disciplines into their own camps. And what ends up to be is a real big omelette of multidisciplinaries, or of a lot of disciplines, rather than interdisciplinarity. When I talk about interdisciplinarity, I really talk about people understanding the mindsets of sociologists, the mindsets of engineers, the mindsets of mathematicians, so that they can work together. Interdisciplinarity really means bringing different disciplines together within the center. And you've got to work that out, how you're going to talk. If you have a group of artists and a group of engineers, you've got to work out your way around how you talk to these people. Because that's very, very important. There have been too many meetings of this kind, and people really retrench. Instead of saying, let's see how we can solve the problem in the middle. That's what I mean. It means simply listening to what people are saying, trying to understand, ask questions, not only about what it is, but why we're talking about this. Try to get into other people's mindset and meet in between. That's all I can say. But we can have another conversation, me and you, if you want, about the more practical aspects of this. But it means a lot of efforts in terms of understanding where other people come from and where you're coming from, and pull things together.
Okay. Hi, I'm Brian Penpraise from Yale and US College. I'm really intrigued by your idea, and since I've come out here to Singapore, I've heard this term key performance indicators, which I didn't know about in the US. And it seems like in many cases what you get, what you're able to foster, is what you can measure. And certainly it's the case with research that it's very easy to quantify impact factors and all the rest. It's getting increasingly easy to assess teaching, and that's why I think, in part, teaching is improving. How would one begin to come up with a KPI for this ethical interprofessionalism and actually begin to assess and measure the impact that someone has on society and the world?
That's one of the reasons why I never decided to be in senior management. Because I want to have the freedom to think about these things, but leave other people, like our provost here, to think about it. But most seriously, I think that one of the secrets of doing this is not to talk about KPIs anymore in very specific terms, but talking about the contribution that people make towards different things in different areas. It's about profiling what people do for an institution to give them promotion for what they do. It means, in a sense, getting rid of all these little tracks which at times get into the way of us thinking more globally about education. Education is about interconnectivity to me, and it's about opening doors. It seems to me that at times, when we talk about KPIs and all that, doors are closed rather than open. And therefore, that's why I was talking about governance. It's a different way of thinking about the educational project, which brings things together rather than dissecting them.
Roberto, I'm Peter Looker from NTU, the other university, and from the Centre for Teaching and Learning there. I was thinking when you were talking about interprofessionalism, of course, there are various kinds of that, and if I go back 30 years or so to the old university that you were talking about, the elitist university that you were talking about, in those days, as an academic, I was solely responsible for designing courses, delivering the courses, assessing them, evaluating them, and I kind of did that. All of us did that in a bubble. Yes, we'd have meetings of our school. We'd talk about what we were doing in the whole program, but basically we were autonomous as teachers. And that seems to me also partly to be product of the way that you become an academic by developing a certain kind of disciplinary expertise through doing a PhD, and that your identity as an academic is partly to do with your disciplinary expertise. Mm-hmm. What I'm seeing at the moment, and this is what this is where the question part comes about in. What I'm seeing at the moment at NTU, for example, is that all the new courses that are being designed now, because they've got a substantial online presence, are no longer the sole responsibility of the faculty member. That they are working with a learning designer, and we've got a very large team of learning designers, something like 70 of them. Wow. And they're working with learning designers, they work with us, and they work with the people who do the evaluations as well. So it's really, new courses now are a team effort involving people who are not academic and not experts in that area. You can see the tensions there. I'm not saying there should be, but there actually are tensions there because of, I suspect, the way that faculty members have become experts and value their expertise, and now that's kind of been compromised in some ways.
At the same time, you may reverse the argument, and you may say that actually your presence is very important because you're not an expert. And in other words, what you're bringing into the equation is the pedagogical argument. When I applied for my job at Imperial, I was there for almost 7 years. When I applied for my job at Imperial, I was trembling in my shoes when I went to the interview because I was not a scientist. And I said, what are they going to do with me? I know nothing about chemistry, nothing about mathematics, fairly nothing about biology. How are they going to make use of it? In the end, the president of the of the panel said, we want to give you the job exactly because you're more of an expert in pedagogy. And you can become a critical friend, you can become a broker, if you like, between different constituencies which are disciplinary based. So I think what you need to do is actually to explain what your role is within that big mass of people. That you're not there to be an expert and suggest that they should do this or that. You're just simply there to orient their thoughts so that they can actually think creatively about how they do things in their own curriculum. And the curriculum stays their own. The question of ownership is very important.
Yes. I agree with all of that, but I still feel that somehow the way the university is structures in a kind... I'll go back a step. You know the Dandria and Gosling book about universities as learning organisations,
Yeah.
and which I love. I mean, if my utopia is that kind of university that's a learning organisation. The problem is the structures get in the way of it. They prevent it.
Yeah.
And the structures, I believe, that most universities still have, including my own, get in the way of proper kind of collaboration in the way that you've just described. So my question is, how do we become those learning organisations where there is interdisciplinarity and interprofessionalism?
Well, I'll come back again to my argument before. Interprofessionalism or ethical interprofessionalism is midway between governance and practice. In other words, if there is no intervention from up to actually change the structure so that people can talk to each other, any effort that you can make yourself from the bottom is going to meet with a lot of difficulty. And therefore, I'm wholeheartedly with you that it has to be something that somebody has to do to actually make these conversations happen between people. And at times I do agree. I mean, we have a Center for Higher Education, Research and Practice in Higher Education, CHERP, of which I am a member of. It always reminds me of a bird whenever I say it, so I never say it. And we work with a lot of other centers which know fairly nothing about what we do. And yet, everybody says that they are great experts about curriculum design. And nobody has thought about, let's these people talk together so that each of them can collaborate at a certain level without entrenching on anybody else.
That's what I'm talking about.
So this is what I mean. It's the great ideas that very often are had at senior management, but these ideas are then not integrated. And that kind of integration is absolutely fundamental when it comes to good practice in the end.